Our speaker this evening is Dr. Samantha Duggan, and this is Samantha's second visit with us. And the talk this evening is called Carrying the Message, the many reasons why 12-step recovery works and why we can be confident to pass it on. Dr. Samantha Duggan is a behavioral psychologist and former lecturer at the University of St. Andrews School of Medicine. She specializes in family systems, and her private practice work focuses on helping improve their ongoing parent-child communication and facilitate psychologically healthy child development. Samantha is secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for 12-Step Recovery and a member of the UK Government's Office for Health Improvement and Disparities Mutual Aid Reference Group. Through this work, she has in recent years become known as a public advocate for 12-step recovery in its many forms, and also co-founder of a wonderful group in the UK called Visible Recovery UK. And I love their slogan, anonymous but not invisible.
Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be back for my second talk. I'm really honored to be invited back again. I really enjoyed my last talk. This one is very different for anybody who saw the last one. It is a completely different topic. I'm going to be really speaking today about my work with the All-Party Parliamentary Group that Patrick has mentioned I am the secretary of. And I thought I'd really tell you the story of how it came to be and what we've been doing in the 4 years that I've had that role. I've called the talk tonight Carrying the Message, which 12-steppers will recognize as being directly out of the 12th step. And this is something that all 12-steppers are encouraged to do, to carry the message to other people who are still suffering. But I use the we in the subtitle of the talk, not just to refer to people who are in 12-step recovery, but maybe just somebody who has a friend who's in 12-step recovery, or perhaps you're a clinician and you work with people who are suffering with alcohol use disorder or substance use disorders. That we refers to you as well. We clinicians and mental health professionals, physicians, we can pass on the message that 12-step recovery works too. And I think today I'm going to be ranging over what I think are a number of the reasons why we are often not confident to pass it on. And I'm hoping to dispel what I consider to be myths around both recovery and 12-step recovery and alcoholism, and also actually anonymity. So why am I, slides not moving on again? Sorry, technical issue. Let me just check. There we go. So why am I speaking to you about this? Well, I've mentioned that I do have a background in research, so I can read research papers. I know how to assess that kind of thing. I'm a behavioral psychologist. My private practice work is what I consider to be the fence at the top of the cliff. I'm going to talk much more about this in my third talk to the Berlin Circle in the next talk. 12-step recovery is what I consider to be the ambulance at the bottom. So 12-step recovery is for people who have already become aware that they have a problem. And 4 years ago now, I became secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. A little bit of a word about what All-Party Parliamentary Groups even are. People in the UK might know some of this already. I know some people are in America. So to help explain, we have two houses of parliament here in the UK, the House of Commons, the House of Lords. You can think of that if you're an American, like the House of Representatives and the Senate. One is the elected members and one are appointed for life. So they get to look at things that are maybe more long-term. They don't have to worry about election cycles quite as much as elected members. And there must be cooperation across the parties that are both in government and opposition. It's a rule for APPGs that you have to have that kind of bipartisan support for your issue. And so the rule insists that you have people from the governing party and the main opposition party. At the moment, that's Conservatives and Labour here in the UK. And we're also very fortunate to have members of the House of Commons and also many members of the House of Lords who are in our group. And actually, we had a moment towards late last year where we wondered if we would be able to continue, because the government tightened the rules about having all-party parliamentary groups very significantly in order to clamp down on it. They had a number of reasons for doing that. I think they were good reasons, but we were a little concerned that we wouldn't be able to clear this very high hurdle, because MPs are now only allowed to support up to 5 APPG groups. Some of them had been on dozens. And so we were very concerned that with our, well, let's just say addiction's not considered to be a sexy political topic. It can be hard to get people to come out in favor of anything that remotely comes close to this, historically considered quite grimy subject. We were hopeful, but we didn't know until just over a month ago that we had achieved it. And in fact, we've exceeded the number, and we're super pleased that we get to keep going, and that our members have picked us as one of their 5 to continue with. So we're thrilled about that. I've put up the website there for the APPG. You'll be able to find out much more about what we've been doing, and also Visible Recovery. It's standard practice here in the UK for APPGs, especially if they get to be a bit busy, to have a charity that supports their work, that does the actual administrative work, that maybe looks to help raising funds to continue the work, and basically does the legwork and keeps too much work away from the already overwhelmed and busy politicians and lords. So that's what Visible Recovery is. I kind of work with both. So this here is the House of Lords, and you recognise, people know that. So the House of Lords is red, Commons is green. So this is the Lords. And a friend of mine who is a person in recovery and also happens to be in the House of Lords, Lord Clive Brooke, he's public about this. So he's more than 40 years in recovery, more than 30 years in the House of Lords, and he is a great advocate for 12-step recovery, has helped very many people to get and maintain their sobriety within the fellowships, as we do. But something was niggling in the back of his mind for many years. Clive and I would often speak at 12-step events and on 12-step retreats, and it was bothering him that maybe he wasn't using his platform, as we now call it. He has this platform, and was he using it as fully as possible within the bounds of the 12-step traditions? And he had also, we've all over here long heard, we see it in the movies. I mean, we know you apparently have this secret 12-step AA meeting in the White House, and we were kind of jealous of that, actually. And we know that in politics, there is actually, unfortunately, an awful lot of the problem of addiction. The bars in Parliament are subsidised, and it's an awful lot cheaper to drink in there than it can be in other parts of the capital. But Clive was very keen that the Houses of Parliament here should have an AA meeting. And I'm pleased to say that we now do. When the Houses are in session, we have an AA meeting once a week in Parliament. So that was something that he definitely wanted to happen. But he was also aware that the research, the body of research, wasn't maybe what it ought to be here in the UK, not the same as in the US. So he gathered a number of people together in March 2020, and he invited me. I thought it was very kind of him to invite me into this meeting, that I thought I'd be a fly on the wall, and that he, knowing my background, sort of let me come in. And it's always wonderful to get in there to the Houses of Parliament. They're spectacular buildings. So I went in to be a fly on the wall, and I went home with a job as the secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and I didn't really know what that would mean. So I had to find out. And one of the things I found out was that all-party parliamentary groups, APPGs, they have evidence sessions. They are able to gather people who are working at the cutting edge, really eminent practitioners in the relevant fields. People don't often turn down an invitation to the British House of Parliament. So I set to work organising some of these evidence sessions and learning more about this topic, which I'm adjacent for sure to this issue. My PhD had been on traumatic memory and that sort of thing, but I wasn't an addictions person really. So I've already hinted at this thing that has become our catchphrase, anonymous, not invisible. And so Clive had started to think that maybe he could be a bit more visible in being a person in recovery. And, you know, we hold the 12 traditions very dear in 12-step recovery. They are the things that ensure the health of our groups and the ongoing continued existence of the fellowships. But, and I wonder, I mean, we can talk about this in the Q&A afterwards. I wonder if maybe what an anonymity means has morphed in the 75 years since AA has been in the UK into something that's perhaps closer or more akin to secrecy than anonymity and its original intention. And I know as well that there's a great discrepancy between how 12-step recovery is viewed in the US and the UK. I learned as well, actually, that there are researchers who have described the culture and the attitude in different countries towards 12-step recovery and distinguished 3 different approaches. One which is considered to be that corresponds more to the invisibility, which is called isolation. And then you have where there's really not an awful lot of communication at all between AA and the professional treatment services. The next level is what we have here in the UK. It would be characteristic of countries like Finland as well, and they call that autonomy. So the fellowships are still very much autonomous, but they have reasonable contact and cooperation with the professional treatment services. The situation in the US is very different. They call that hegemony, and there you have really strong links and interactions between 12-step recovery movement and the professional treatment services. The idea that you would be referred by a court to 12-step recovery instead of going to prison, that's not a thing here in the UK. I know that you have that in the US. So anyway, we are very interested to see, have we taken maybe a little bit of a misstep in how we approach our anonymity here in the UK? And do we need to maybe, not everybody, this is of course just a suggestion, but I've adopted it for myself that I have elected to be a little bit more visible rather than invisible. And let me tell you a story. The other day I had somebody in my house delivering a piece of furniture. And I was getting ready to leave to go to a meeting, 12-step meeting. And I came in to say, have you got everything? And do you need anything? And I'm off now. And this person said to me, oh, you look nice. Where are you off to? And it was such a direct question and so unexpected that I had a split second to think. And I decided to answer it honestly. And I said, actually, I'm a recovering alcoholic and I'm going to an AA meeting. And then I felt that flush of, oh my goodness, what have I said? And that's become very familiar to me in the past 4 years as I share in increasing numbers of situations where I would have kept it a secret, very often professional situations, but also that. I mean, there is nothing in the AA traditions that say that I couldn't do that. I remember hearing another story where somebody was telling this story and they said they were asked by a cashier in the supermarket, oh, what are you doing later this evening? And I was about to say that I was off to my AA meeting when I caught myself and I stopped myself saying it, thank goodness. And I remember hearing that story and thinking, this is sad. You know, this is not a requirement for membership in AA, that we never mention it to anybody who's only an acquaintance or maybe even a complete stranger. And I just thought, you know, who knows what could come of being brave enough to take that step? I mean, who could even say that, you know, we would be in recovery today if the early founders had been as invisible today as sometimes I am. And interestingly, the person who was delivering that piece of furniture came back and shared that he suspected that he might have a potential problem, that he was planning going to get drunk when he finished his shift. So I ended up having a quick chat with him before I left, and thought, oh my goodness, that was scary. Not saying this stuff isn't scary. That was scary, but you know, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have put, I call it a pebble in his shoe. You know, maybe he'll never go to a meeting. Maybe he went to a meeting already, but you know, something that will just hopefully trigger a curiosity. So anonymous, not invisible. That's become our catchphrase. So as we're talking about how to encourage people and to ourselves be more visible in our recovery, and working on these evidence sessions, we're having other wonderful opportunities because, you know, as I said, the Parliament has opened up these opportunities. It's been really fantastic. I'll maybe share a few more of them as I go along. But in July 2021, completely unbeknownst to us that this was going to happen, Dan Carden, the Member of Parliament for Liverpool Walton, stood up in the House of Commons and became the first person to, in effect, out himself and become visible as a person in recovery from alcohol addiction. His speech is online. It whipped around the recovery community in the UK, as you can imagine. He does mention the Fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous, but he doesn't refer to himself as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. So he keeps within the traditions and talks about himself the way I do in these situations, as a person in long-term recovery and having achieved that with the help of 12-step fellowships. So he stood up, said that he'd had this problem, that he was now some 3 years in recovery. And of course, we immediately contacted him and asked him if he would get involved in our APPG. And I'm happy to say that since then, he's become a really pivotal member of the APPG. And it was his idea, this thing I'll explain later, recovery fairs or something that were Dan's brainchild. He had the idea that he would like one of these things in his constituency. I'll come on to that a little bit later. So Dan stood up and made himself visible. While he was plotting his speech in the House of Commons, I was plotting this celebration service in St. Margaret's, Westminster. This church, you can see from Big Ben, that's not photoshopped or anything. That is actually how close it is to the Houses of Parliament, and the roof in the background that you can see behind it, that's the much, much larger Westminster Abbey, which is so famous from, you know, the wedding of the current Prince and Princess of Wales. But, you know, one of the amazing things that has happened as a result of the APPG is that people have offered us to come and speak at events, and in 2021 we were offered the use of this magnificent building, this gorgeous church, for an evening, and we decided to put on a service celebrating recovery and people in recovery. Our inspiration here is really the LGBT pride movement. So there was a time when the stigma around being gay was so horrendous that people were invisible in that. And it took courageous members of the LGBT community to come out, make themselves visible and say, this is what we are. We're letting you know, and we're not going to hide anymore. So that was the idea. And COVID restrictions were just coming to an end. Of course, we'd all been through that period. And though the capacity of the church is normally 3,000, we were allowed to have 300 people. And it was our first go at doing anything like that. We had to make it all up from scratch. And it was so worth it, because the feedback that we got from that, people felt empowered, overjoyed, really part of something. And it felt really quite special to be right at the heart of the center of power in London. And the Archbishop of Canterbury wrote a message for us. He wasn't able to attend. We had planned this really with not an awful lot of time to go, and people like that, their diaries are full way in advance, but he loved the idea of what we were doing, and he sent us a message to read out, and we learned that his life had been touched by both addiction and 12-step recovery, and we were absolutely thrilled to learn that he was positively disposed towards that. And so we were invited back the following year, and we did another one, and we're settling on maybe every 2 years we'll do this. And, you know, in my imagination, I want to have these in cathedrals or churches in all of the, you know, in Scotland, in Wales, in England, in Northern Ireland. And, you know, if anybody wants to copy us and do this wherever they are, I'd be delighted to speak to anybody about the format that we used. And it was also wonderful. One of the lovely things that came of this was I was told the story of two cousins, each in recovery. Neither of them knew until they found out that they were both coming to London for this recovery service. So, you know, hopefully now, I think people are starting to get the idea that these are suggestions only. And if people don't want to be more visible, that's of course absolutely fine. But if you're that kind of person that is quite happy to let people know that you're in recovery, then we're creating places, beautiful places and beautiful ways in which we can do that. So that was a lot of fun as well. So I said that one of the goals was to get familiar with the research and policy. We had thought initially that we could make recommendations to improve policy in the UK. But as I looked into it, I found that in fact, addiction policy in the UK is pretty good already. So while the APPG was getting going in the early 2020s, the UK had commissioned Dame Carol Black, who was a former president of Newnham College, Cambridge, and she was a physician, and she was looking into drug policy and alcohol use abuse policy here in the UK and going to make recommendations for how it could be improved. The end result of that was that she recommended that we focus on improving treatment and recovery services, not to the detriment of harm reduction services. That's a massive part of our way of tackling this in the UK as well. But the result was that an extra £421 million was made available for treatment and recovery services here in the UK. I also found out that the NICE guidelines, that's the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, they publish guidelines on the gold standard way of dealing with different illnesses. And we have in the UK somebody called a recovery champion, Dr. Ed Day, an addiction psychiatrist. I met him at the first APPG meeting, and he had been drafted in to rewrite and improve the clinical guidelines around alcohol use disorder. And encountering 12-step recovery and being the national champion for recovery, as he had been for a few years, he made sure to write into the guidelines that clinicians absolutely ought to signpost people to, they call them mutual aid groups. The biggest mutual aid groups in the UK are Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and Cocaine Anonymous. There are other non-12-step fellowship mutual aid organizations like Smart Recovery, and they don't distinguish between those in the guidelines, but facilitating access to mutual aid is a part of what you are supposed to do for people with alcohol use disorder, but it doesn't really happen. So we found that there was this gap between policy and implementation. And so we set about seeing if we could maybe in any way close that, make that gap smaller. So how are we going to do that? Well, we found that there are certain things that people repeat over and over and over when you start to talk about Alcoholics Anonymous or 12-step recovery and also addiction. So I'm going to come on now to these I call them myths, borrowed from Tony Mercer gave me that nomenclature initially. So myths and realities. And I think this is a key reason why AA works so well, is that we don't fall prey to these myths as much as ordinary people and clinicians. This is the first myth. AA doesn't work, or it's negative, or it's harmful, it's a cult, it doesn't take long to find these kinds of headlines and articles and books and movies. I don't know if anybody's maybe seen the documentary, The 13th Step. It's incredibly negative about Alcoholics Anonymous in America. We see here, verbs like despise. This is behind my little myth elastoplast, but it says cult or cure. The dominant idea out there 4 years ago was that it doesn't work. And I'm here to tell you, banging this drum over and over, this couldn't be further from the truth. Of course, in AA, we've always known that it works if you work it, right? But there's a big difference between it works colloquially, it works for some people, it worked for me, and no, it just works. And we now have incontrovertible evidence that 12-step recovery, it doesn't just work, it works better than the next best thing. The two next best things, actually. So in order of most likely to succeed in recovering from alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, it's Alcoholics Anonymous, 12-step recovery, followed by motivational interviewing, followed by cognitive behavioral therapy. And I know this because in 2020, I can say this with total confidence, in 2020, there was a Cochrane review published. The Cochrane review is the gold standard for research clinical evidence in the world. And it's not just one study. It's a review of all the relevant studies, and the criteria for inclusion in the reviews are set in advance. So people who know that it's much harder to fiddle the data on a Cochrane review because you have to set your parameters in advance, and you can't mine the data backwards, which is something that everybody who's done research knows happens. So there have been many studies done over the years, and the Cochrane review whittled all of those down to studies that met a really high standard of evidence. And there were 35 of those included in the review. They took place in 5 different countries. There were 145 different researchers involved in these studies and over 10,000 participants. So this is really powerful evidence. And it showed that there wasn't a single study in which Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step facilitation was less effective. And on balance, I hear we've had 2 of the authors of the review have come and addressed the APPG for us. And they, you can often hear them say, Keith Humphreys at Harvard will often say it's twice as effective. But what I've said here, it is most definitely more effective than the next best treatment. There was a study that showed 60% more effective. And what he likes to say is if there was a cancer drug that was this much more effective for your cancer than the next best treatment, there isn't a person on the planet who would be asking for the second best treatment. And of course, as we all know, it's free. So the writers of the Cochrane Review also like to say that it's the closest thing to a free lunch that the health and treatment services are ever going to encounter. And this didn't surprise me in the least because, Alcoholics Anonymous comprises multiple therapeutic modalities. We know that it's kind of informal CBT, things, altered attitude. You're taught a new way thinking about everything, including your alcoholism. We know that it provides people with a new place to belong that is supportive of maintaining abstinence and sobriety. And people are often very worried about what they call the abstinence violation effect. You'll have seen it on the myth slide, alluded to there, that this idea that by holding up such a high standard of abstinence and considering anything that doesn't attain that a relapse, they think that we make things worse for people who are trying to recover from addiction or alcohol use problems. The Cochrane Review also looked at that, and there's no evidence whatsoever that AA makes people worse. In fact, for people who are serial, what we sometimes call serial relapsers, or they're on the merry-go-round of denial still, or they're in and out, they're clocking up some sobriety. The evidence shows that even those people who don't ever maintain long-term stable sobriety, they drink less, not more. That's what the evidence shows. So it's called the abstinence violation effect, and there is no evidence to show that it exists. Right. This, I think, is another reason why Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step fellowships work so much better than the next best things. It's because we have a much better understanding of what addiction looks like. It is 2024, and still the idea that an alcoholic is a park bench drunk persists. It persists really strongly. I hear all the time from people who are in 12-step recovery that they didn't think it was them for as long as they did, because this is what an alcoholic looks like. And of course, in Alcoholics Anonymous, we learn that it's not about that. I mean, if I speak about my journey, I conform to what AA has in the third section. You know, the way the big book is divided into 3 sections. There are the people who lost everything at the start, and then there are the people who, in big book nomenclature, it's called they stopped in time, and it uses wonderful little expressions like little more than a sometimes uncontrollable nuisance, or scarcely more than potential alcoholics. So we understand that alcoholism is progressive. We also understand in the 12-step world that addiction doesn't just mean drugs and alcohol. We know that it means gambling. We know that it means pornography. We know that it means social media. We know that it means eating compulsively or not eating compulsively. We know that it means putting others first and helping others to your own detriment compulsively. We know that it means, I'm racing through the different sorts of fellowships that I know we've got. We have over 30 fellowships in the UK that apply the 12 steps to multiple different dependencies that we can understand really as addiction. I know that the research is progressing and looking into food, I think is quite interesting. So even more than sex or gaming addictions, the research is really pressing ahead with understanding that by applying the addiction framework to food problems, and particularly obesity and compulsive overeating, we might be able to help people with that problem better than we currently can. So that's the myth. It keeps lots of people from asking for help. It keeps lots of people from understanding themselves that they have a problem. This is the reality. Over 70% of alcoholics are employed. There are different studies. Some show over 70%, some show over 80%. Most alcoholics have jobs, and that's the substance situations. People with the other problems, they most definitely have jobs. Are we working at our best performance? No, because it's progressive and it gets worse over time, as those of us who have been there know. We are subject to absenteeism and presenteeism. And when I was preparing for the evidence session on alcoholism, addiction, and work, the workplace, I found out that, for example, it's a really serious problem. 33% of UK companies have had to discipline a staff member for alcohol or drug misuse. And 22% of people, this is really new research published by the CIPD, that's the biggest sort of HR and professional development body here in the UK. It's the one that all the big organizations sign up to and pay attention to. And their data shows that 22% of employers in the UK have had to dismiss an employee for alcohol or drug misuse. And so this is a very widespread problem. And we all know about the drinking culture associated with work. So I'm going to talk later on, just near the end of my talk, about what we've done about how much of about the research that we found that showed what a widespread problem it is. And secondly, there's new research that's showing that people who engage with recovery on the recommendation of their employer have greater success getting into and sustaining recovery. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's so interesting. And it makes sense. Families, there can be so much emotional intensity around family, and it's the family that has often really has been at the cold face and really suffered at the hands of substance and alcohol use issues, that it can be quite tricky to recommend to a family member. But employers seem to have really great success with employees who come to them, especially those who come to them and say, I have a problem. It goes better for you if you've got a problem and you go to your employer first rather than waiting for them to find out. You're much less likely to find yourself in a disciplinary procedure or dismissed if you, again, get brave and get a little bit visible in a situation where you wouldn't normally have done so. So that's the reality. This is the third one. So we ran an evidence session on AA and spirituality, 12-step recovery and spirituality. The UK and Europe is very secular. It's considerably more secular over here and has been for a long time than in the US. And I think this is part of the reason, perhaps as well, it must be part of the reason why AA hasn't spread in quite the same way in the UK as in the US. We're just that little bit more skeptical about anything that mentions the word God. And so particularly in healthcare settings, interestingly, we don't have this sort of formal constitutionally protected separation of church and state that you have in the US. So, but even though we don't have it formalized, there is a kind of an unspoken rule that you just don't mention it. It's considered a little bit crazy, a little bit impolite. You could probably find yourself getting sanctioned if you were to bring up the God word in certain healthcare settings. And so this idea persists that AA is a religion or a cult. And as anybody who has really encountered it or looked into it knows, it's just not true. AA is spiritual, not religious. Although I was reading some research relatively recently that shows that for certain healthcare professionals, they are as put off by the idea that it's spiritual as they are by the idea that it's religious. So I have decided to make this another hill which I am willing to die on, because even though this taboo exists, it's so unhelpful, and I'm sure it's leading to worse health outcomes, not just for alcoholics and addicts, but for people generally, because the evidence is really clear that having a faith, having a spirituality is actually really good for you. It's good for your happiness. It's good for your physical health. It's good for your mental health. It's good for your marriage. It's just a good thing to have a spiritual practice. And I think things like the growing popularity of mindfulness and, practices like yoga speak to the fact that people do find that when they develop that side of their person, that they like it, they actually like it. And I think, 12-step spirituality is completely self-created, it's God, group of drunks, great outdoors, gift of desperation, good orderly direction. And in fact, actually, the latest AA members survey in the UK shows this quite clearly. 35% of people in AA in the UK have what they tick the box to say that they had an overtly religious concept of a higher power. But 65% of people who answered this question said that their higher power had a secular basis. The newest one I heard just yesterday, I heard of an atheist in AA whose higher power is cheese. It's like, there you go. Go figure, as anybody who's tried the 12-step method will go, it just has to be not you. So what's my takeaway? I suppose my takeaway is don't be afraid to mention the spiritual component of Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step fellowships. The data is on our side. I've thrown this in here as well. I've sort of already mentioned it. And, you know, I've been thinking over the past 4 years, I've really noticed that here in the UK and even in Alcoholics Anonymous itself, I think there's still a taboo about mentioning God. And so I forced myself to put this slide in here to try and say, you know, I don't know about others, but I make it a practice of me to try and at least occasionally mention the God word in an AA meeting and speak about my spiritual practice, because it's almost as though, perhaps this is just me, perhaps people will say, I don't know what you're talking about, Samantha, that's all in your head. But it sometimes feels to me like because of the taboo of not mentioning God, it feels almost as though, you know, the atheists are allowed to speak about being atheists, but you know, the God Squad are not allowed to speak about being members of the God Squad. So I think as well that the time has come for us to stop being scared about this. There's nothing forceful about 12-step spirituality. I understand that people were nervous because of things that happened in the past, but 12-step spirituality, I think, is super suited to a tolerant and inclusive, modern, post-Christian, secular society such as ours. Okay, I'm going to move towards the end now, telling you about recovery fairs and these workshops that we're creating. So Dan Carden, one day after he got involved with us, he said, do you know what, I'd really like if you could put on an event in my constituency. I'll invite all the people who work with the addicts, the alcoholics. I'll invite them all. I'll get my constituency officers, maybe more chance that they'll come if it comes, you know, on headed paper. And I want you to get the fellowships. Do you think you can get the fellowships in one room? And basically, let's run a PI event, but instead of it being just Narcotics Anonymous or just Cocaine Anonymous or just Al-Anon, let's see if we can get them all in the room. Lots of the fellowships talk about how they cooperate with other fellowships, but apart from the Al-Anon meeting and the shared platform at AA conventions, we found that there really wasn't any cooperation between the fellowships here in the UK, at least. So we did this. We've carried out 6 of them now around the UK, 2 in Liverpool, 1 in Brighton, 1 in Worthing, London. And we've got one coming up in Guildford. Anybody who's able to is invited. It's on the 10th of May. You can find information about it on our website, or if you Google Recovery Fair Guildford Eventbrite, you'll be able to register to come. Tickets are free. You just need to register. So we basically do a combination of lived experience shares, experience, strength, and hope. We have 3 different fellowships that people maybe have never heard of, who stand up and do a little 8-minute share on how they found recovery. And then we do a whittled down, short, small AA meetings. We've always done AA meetings. That's what I like to do because that's the one that's really well evidenced. We have a secretary, a chair, 4 fellowship members who share back, and it's just witnessed by maybe anywhere between 80 and 120 people in the room. And what we found, that we asked people when they arrived, the professionals who work with people who have addiction problems and who could refer if they were to follow the NICE guidelines, less than half of them do. So less than half of them follow the NICE guidelines, and they tell us that before the recovery fair starts. Then we have the fair, and they see these things and they hear these stories, and we ask them again, would you recommend it now that you've seen it? And 97%, that were running at an average shift from just under half, would recommend, to almost 100% will recommend it once they've participated or witnessed, taken part in a recovery fair. This is an election year, so we're doing our one in Guildford May, and then we're going to back off because we need the cooperation of the MP. It's the MP who is the host and does a little bit of a speech and everything. And what we're doing as a result of our evidence session on addiction in the workplace, we've pivoted and we're now putting our energies into creating a workshop for HR and the well-being teams in employers. So if a business is big enough to have a HR department, this is for them. We're creating the workshop. It can run between 1 and 2 hours long. We can slightly adjust the format and the content depending on how much time an employer is willing to give us. We can make things more suitable as well for the type of organization that it is. But basically, this is think of it as a public information event, but rather than talking about one fellowship, we're talking about all the fellowships that are available in the UK. We've trialed it with some really big employers. They've given us some great feedback, and we're going to get it CPD accredited. That's in process. For people who don't know, CPD, there are certain professions that have to have ongoing, continuing professional development. And there's an organization here in the UK that gives a rubber stamp to suitable of these educational materials. So we're hopefully going to get this workshop CPD rubber stamped and take it into workplaces and really try to build on that evidence that shows that employers are really well positioned to help people get into recovery. And as I said earlier, we know that they have this problem. We suffering alcoholics and addicts, we're everywhere and very often in work. So that is my big ask and my headline thing for today's talk. Would you like to get involved? Do you work still? Do you work in an organization that has a HR department? Could you imagine yourself becoming a little bit visible at work? One of the things I found, I'll just finish with this. This is my last piece of data for you. The most recent AA member survey again asked, how did you get into recovery? Let us know. 38% of people, the biggest number, got in from a friend. So that's 12-stepping friend to friend. Real classic how AA has always worked. The next biggest was 30% who got into recovery on their own. That's me. That's the category I was in. It's 12% from healthcare professionals and 3% through work. So that's where we're aiming our efforts for the foreseeable future. And it's very standard practice to charge for CPD workshops. And so we're hoping that that will generate some funds in order that we can then take the recovery fairs into more and more communities. So that's what I've been up to. Websites are up there again if you want to go and have a little look. As I said, if you're able to come on the 10th of May to Guildford, if that's in your wheelhouse, you can get tickets by Googling any of these sorts of terms, and Eventbrite, you'll find them. Our annual report there at Visible Recovery sort of fleshes out what I've been talking about here today as well. And if you wanted to pass it on to anybody, for example, you could find our report there online. But it's time now for Q&A. I hope that maybe you've learned something, or maybe you've got something to think about, or maybe you've got a question, or maybe you yourself would like to get a little bit more visible. But that's what we've been up to. Thank you very much for listening.
Wow, thank you very much, Samantha. You carried the message so well, and it's such an important message.